Now the paroxysmal cold hemoglobinuria. We were discussing about the paroxysmal cold hemoglobinuria, and so then we not only have the characteristic history, but the peripheral smear findings, then the DAT, and then also the retic count, which is initially increased, but later on it is which is initially decreased. That is reticulocytopenia in the early phase, and with the recovery there is reticulocytosis, and then even after this test we need to first rule out the chronic there's cold hemagglutinin syndrome. Um, After this has been excluded based on the history and on the other features that have been mentioned for cold hemagglutinin syndrome, that is all the other causes for secondary cold agglutinin disease, like paraproteinemias and bone marrow has been taken to exclude underlying lymphoma, and Waldenstrom macroglobulinemia has been excluded by paraprotein levels done with serum samples tested at 7 degrees centigrade. Um, then we need to proceed with the findings of then we need to proceed with the findings of cold of these history of basically the history would not only include the history of any sort of underlying malignancy or myeloma or infection with mononucleosis or infectious mononucleosis or mycoplasma, but also the cold associated symptoms in history, and then atypical serological features under patient less than 18 years. These could also trigger patients who have this, who are less than 18 years of age, so they are basically in the uh, they are basically in the zone that is going to be excluded for PCH as well, and also those with atypical serological findings, and then hemoglobin, urea, and cold associated symptoms. They are investigated using the Donat-Landsteiner antibody test. And that is negative in some cases of PCH. So the Donat-Landsteiner antibody then should be considered in children with hemolysis, homoglobinuria, and a negative DAT. So mostly the mnemonic for PCH is also that it's like kids, complement, and like it's mostly in children, and there's complement activation, and then there's this biphasic antibody that causes and the activation is usually, and here the underlying cause is also cold activation, so it's basically kids, complement, and cold. And the mixed autoimmune hemolytic anemia is caused by a combination of a warm IgG antibody and a cold IgM. And so there could be a mixed IgG and a warm. And here the thermal amplitude is very great. So these usually have in the mixed toppers, it could be either IgG or IgM, and the IgG is the warm IgG usually lacks specificity, and the warm antibody usually lacks specificity, and the cold antibody may be anti-I or anti-big I or anti-small I, or this may also lack specificity. So both in the mixed type, there is actually lack of specificity of whether it's a warm or a cold, or because it's a mixed phenotype. And then the cold antibody here may have a low titer, and the thermal amplitude is usually however more than 30, same as for cold, so it is usually more at 30 degrees centigrade. It behaves like it has features both of cold antibody and those of warm antibody. Then the warm autoimmune hemolytic anemias, they bind optimally at 37, and the antibody titer at 4 degrees centigrade would not be applicable. But for cold, they have the same as the titer is low with less than 1:64, and the thermal amplitude is also more than 30 degrees centigrade. Now the cold associated symptoms rarely appear in these patients, and the cold antibody may have a low antibody titer, but with a thermal range amplitude of up to 30 to 37. So it can be diagnosed with a DAT positive for IgG and C3d, and a cold antibody with a thermal range more than equal to 30 degrees centigrade in appropriate clinical picture. Now, this cold agglutinin syndrome, this can be diagnosed in patients with laboratory criteria consistent with a clinically significant cold antibody that occurs in association with, since the primary cold agglutinin disease is the one that is referred to as cold hemagglutinin disease, and secondary is mostly referred to as cold agglutinin syndrome. So this occurs mostly in the background of secondary disorders like infections and SLE, and also in cases of aggressive lymphomas. So if there's a clinical, there's secondary disorders associated and there is a clinically significant cold antibody, then we would go on with the diagnosis of a cold agglutinin syndrome. In the cold agglutinin disease or the primary cold agglutinin syndrome, there is the cause there may be, as we discussed earlier, there may be underlying lymphoproliferative bone marrow disease, and its pathophysiology is unclear, but the hemolysis is caused by the IgM antibodies. Here the IgM antibodies, they that are active in vitro at low temperatures, and in vivo these antibodies, they bind red cells in the cooler peripheral circulation, causing agglutination that leads to acrocyanosis or Raynaud's disease. And the IgM, this binds actually on the red blood cells. The IgM, this binds the C1q protein on the RBC membrane, activating the classical complement, so that C4b to B, and then therefore the activation of the classical complement C3b occurs. This activates the classical component, but it dissociates from the red blood cells when this happens in the cold peripheries, but in the warm core central part of the circulation, these IgM antibodies, they elute from this. They actually disappear from the red cells, but leading to a DAT that is characteristically positive for only C3d. So only C3d is therefore then detected on the cells, because the IgM antibodies, they would in the cooler part of the circulation, they dissociate from the IgM. So there is a lot of bystander sort of effect also, where the IgM antibodies, they come off the red surface of the red cells, and then they can go on to um, actually bind to other red cell antibodies. So other red cells may also show this feature of hemolysis. And also when the red blood cells are lysed, the IgM will also dissociate, and they can bind to bystander RBCs, and so antibody titer is usually very low in case of cold agglutinin disease. Sometimes, as I mentioned, that the antibody titer can be less. This is mostly because most of the cells may also have lysed at the point in which the titer was taken. So if the titer is taken, if initially the titer is taken at 4 degrees centigrade, it would be greater than 500. But it can be less if most of the IgM has dissociated from the red cells, and even after the acute phase, sometimes the antibody persists for 2 to 8 months even, and even maybe detected even years after. So the antibody sometimes maybe even after the acute phase, they may persist for some time. So this was briefly about all the different types of antibodies. That is the cold. We had first gone into the features of cold, warm autoimmune hemolytic anemia, and also the cold hemagglutinin disease, and which showed that marked agglutination, but no feature was specific, except that we needed to do the titer and thermal amplitude. And then regarding the primary cold hemagglutinin disease and the cold agglutinin syndrome, we also went into the difference and the PCH and the mixed type. Now regarding the diagnostic pathway, this diagnostic pathway is given in figure 1, which shows that basically the patients with autoimmune hemolytic anemia and a DAD positive for C3 and IgG should be screened for a cold antibody. Now basically this is the diagnostic pathway for the cold agglutinin cold antibodies. That is whenever the DAT is positive for the C3 and the G, you should screen for the cold antibody first, and first are excluded. Now, a direct agglutination test can be performed as a screening tool in the local transfusion laboratory, and this a clinically significant cold hemagglutinin can be excluded if the saline suspended normal cells are not agglutinated by the patient's serum after incubation at room temperature for 30 to 60 minutes. So the procedure for a direct antiglobulin test is that the patient's serum, that the normal RBCs are suspended in saline, and they are tested against the patient's serum. So if the serum contains these direct agglutinating antibodies of the PCH, then if the serum is kept at room temperature for 30 to 60 minutes, this was cause agglutination. Then if it gets kept for 30 to 60 minutes, the cells of the normal RBCs, they are not agglutinated. However, if this screening is positive, further testing is needed to distinguish insignificant cold antibodies from cold agglutination syndrome from the secondary cold agglutination syndrome from primary cold agglutinin disease. So in this test, basically the cold agglutinins, they can be excluded if we do this direct agglutination test, which can be done even in the local transfusion laboratory. The Donat-Landsteiner test is done in special reference laboratories. In the local transfusion laboratory, we can only just do this baseline test of excluding cold antibodies if saline suspended normal red cells are not agglutinated by the patient's serum after incubation at room temperature for 30 to 60 minutes. So if for 30 to 60 minutes, the normal RBCs and the patient's serum, they are incubated for 30 to 60 minutes at room temperature, then there should be no agglutination with normal RBCs. So if the patient serum does not agglutinate the normal RBCs, it does not contain the relevant cold agglutinin antibodies. So samples for titers and thermal amplitude should be kept at 37 degrees centigrade for transportation. So if however the patient and the red blood cell sample, they show agglutination, then we need to go further test for the specific cold agglutinin disease, and the direct agglutination test, the PCH should be done, and then for this the samples should be kept at 37 degrees centigrade for transportation. As this can be challenging, received EDTA's anticoagulated samples should be warmed to 37 degrees centigrade in a water bath for 1 hour before testing. So either the samples should be transported at 37 degrees centigrade, or either before testing they should be warmed in a water bath. So these are basically guidelines for transportation and before testing. So the testing should be done at 37 degrees centigrade for calculation of titers and thermal amplitude. That is, these cold agglutinin antibodies that first need to be kept at 37 degrees centigrade. Then during the testing, of course, the titers they are calculated at 4 degrees centigrade, and the thermal amplitude is also calculated with the um, when the temperature is raised. When we go on raising the temperature from 4 degrees centigrade to 25 and then 35 and above. So the thermal amplitude would, of course, the range we need to calculate, but the titer is calculated at 4 degrees centigrade. So the samples, they are transported at 37 degrees centigrade, and or either if the sample is received, the ATTS sample is received, then it is warmed in a water bath 1 hour before testing to bring it to its optimal temperature. Now we'll go to the algorithm that they had mentioned here. That is the evidence. When there is evidence of hemolytic anemia, then direct antiglobulin test is done, and if it is positive, then we will proceed along the lines of hemolytic anemia assessment. And but first we need to exclude the alternative causes for hemolytic anemia and a positive DAT. That is, if the DAT is positive, we need to exclude the false positive DATs. So false positive DATs include all those cases where we had discussed that the DAT could be positive in patients who have received this drug history of IVIG or uh, antithymocyte globulin being given. Then even after hemolytic, if there is a history of transfusion, then hemolytic transfusion reaction and hemolytic disease of newborn in cases of fetus, then it could be drug induced even with IVIG and antithymocyte globulin. Then even a post transplantation, even an ABO mismatch and passenger lymphocyte syndrome, that could be positive. So we need to rule out all those causes which are alternate causes for hemolytic anemia and a positive DAT. And also, if DAT is negative, then we need to take into account all the alternative causes that can cause hemolytic anemia. So it could be either all those causes that can cause not only just autoimmune hemolysis, but this is the table that mentions all the causes of congenital and acquired hemolysis. So in congenital hemolysis, we need to rule out the enzymopathies, the membranopathies, and the hemoglobinopathies. And then in the acquired causes, we need to rule out all the immune causes, the causes of or autoimmune drug induced, and in the non-immune there is all those causes of mechanical, physical, and chemical interactions. It is the drug interactions and oxidant stress, and all the causes of PNH, and even after infections. They could be significant hemolysis and severe infections with malaria and tuberculosis, and also they had mentioned Clostridium perfringens, then hypersplenism, and then extracorporeal circuits even with severe burn. So all those causes of like mechanical obstruction in the blood vessels, they can also cause this. Those can be non-immune causes of hemolysis. So all those causes of hemolysis, they first need to be ruled out. If cause is unclear, then can we repeat that using column agglutination method, including the monospecific reagent. So, and also if we could use monospecific reagents to IgG, IgM, A, and C3. And Donat-Landsteiner antibody in children with hemoglobinuria is then in children who have this typical history of hemoglobinuria and hemolysis and a negative DAT, then the Donat-Landsteiner antibodies should be considered. If the DAT is negative, that is for PCH, we need to first document a negative DAT. So they would be children with hemoglobinuria and hemolysis. So the DAT is that there is evidence of hemolysis and the DAT is negative. Then they are children and they have hemoglobinuria. So these four considerations need to be taken into account when we consider testing for for Donald-Lanston antibodies. And this Donald-Lanston antibodies testing is done in specialist laboratories, and the warm separated serum sample is required. For this, the warm separated serum sample is required, and we need to have excluded out the causes of primary cold hemagglutinin disease. And this can also, and also if the patient of primary cold agglutinin disease shows features atypical serological features and is less than 18 years of age and has cold associated symptoms, then even we may go on to assess him for paroxysmal cold hemoglobinuria. So if basically if the DAT is negative, then this is the considerations that we will, these are the analytical considerations that we will take into account. And then also our diagnostic considerations would also be different, as we could also then start suspecting PCH. However, if the DAT is positive, then we need to first rule out all these alternative causes of hemolysis in a positive DAT. And then if the cause is not alloimmune and it is not drug induced, and then we will left only with autoimmune hemolysis and a positive DAT, then we will consider this autoimmune hemolytic anemia. And for then also we need to specify whether it's a warm or a cold or a mixed sort of an antibody. So then we will proceed with the DAT. And if the DAT is positive for IgG only, then this specifically suggests warm autoimmune hemolytic anemia. If the DAT is positive for both the IgG and C3 or alone the C3 even, then we need to do a direct agglutination test, a screen. This is sort of a screen done at room temperature. This direct agglutination test done at room temperature is when the patient's serum is incubated with the saline suspended normal cells for 30 to 60 minutes at room temperature. So then at room temperature, basically the patient's serum is tested with normal RBCs, RBC suspension, and this is kept at for 30 to 60 minutes. And if the agglutination, and we test for agglutination. So if the agglutination is not there, then these clinically significant hemagglutinins can be excluded. So if this agglutination does not come out to be positive, then clinically significant hemagglutinins can be excluded, and we are left with only the diagnosis of paroxysmal cold hemoglobinuria, in which case we would then again have to take into account that its age should be less than 18 years of age. There should be hemoglobinuria, cold associated hemolysis, and atypical serological features that would lead us on to test for Donald-Lanston antibody. If these atypical features are not there, then we can consider it as warm autoimmune hemolytic anemia. In cases with the Donald-Lanston test, which is done at warmed separated serum sample, if this Donald-Lanston test is positive, then of course it's a paroxysmal cold hemoglobinuria. If this is negative, then again it is a warm autoimmune hemolytic anemia. So all those cases with a typical history and then features of hemolysis and the DAT is positive, they they can be classified as warm autoimmune hemolytic anemia. Then all those features, then all those that all those that positive cases that are to show this C3 positivity along with plus minus IgG. In them, a direct agglutination screen is done at room temperature, and then following this direct agglutination screen, if they are negative, then clinically significant cold antibodies are excluded, and then the warm then only the warm auto antibodies remain, and we can then suspect warm auto antibodies if these atypical features are not there. If these atypical features are present along with the no clinically significant cold agglutinin, then we will of course consider them for testing for Donald-Lanston antibody. And also, if the direct agglutinin test is of course positive, then we consider that clinically this direct agglutination test will test for clinically significant cold antibodies. So if the clinically significant cold antibodies are absent, then of course we are left with only the warm antibodies that are giving this positive DAT. If the clinically significant cold antibodies are positive as shown by the direct agglutination test, then we need to quantify the titer. You need to quantify the titer in order to show whether it's a primary cold to differentiate the CHAD and cold agglutinin syndrome. So if the titer is less than 1 is to 64, then of course these are insignificant cold agglutinins, and they and only if these features are present, then we need to further investigate them along the lines of Donald-Lanssteiner antibodies. If the titer is more than 64, that is, it may be about 1 is to 1 ratio 100 even, or sometimes it may be less, as they had mentioned that it can be less. The titer can be of these cold agglutinin syndromes can be less in certain cases, and then we need to look into whether the DAT. Then we need to do the DAT either whether it is positive only for C3 alone or for combined C3 plus IgG. If it is positive for C3 alone, then of course it's a cold hemagglutinin disease. If it is positive, that is the history in this case the history is suggestive, and the DAT is positive for C3 alone, and then the titer is also more than 64. So all these then suggest this cold hemagglutinin disease. However, if the DAT is positive for C3 along with IgG, and then further clinical and serological assessment needs to be done to differentiate between mixed and mixed autoimmune hemolytic anemia and cold hemagglutinin disease. Now, another thing that we had also discussed earlier was that these titers, when we have differentiated the warm or autoimmune hemolytic anemias from the cold type using the direct agglutination test, if the direct agglutination test comes out positive, we are suspecting mostly cold agglutinin disease. Then to differentiate between CHAD and cold agglutinin syndrome, we will then do the titer the sample. We test the sample for titers and thermal amplitude. And for this, they had mentioned earlier that the sample needs to be received in EDTA, and it should be either transported in EDTA at room temperature, or if it is received in EDTA, it should be warmed to 37 degrees centigrade in a water bath for 1 hour before testing. So this warming of the sample at 1 hour before testing is a prerequisite to the testing for the antibody titer. Um, So this algorithm that we have gone into detail is a guide, and the diagnosis is not always straightforward. So the clinical picture should be considered, and the advice of a reference laboratory may be required before the final diagnosis is made. A limitation of serological testing, cold antibody, a limitation of the serological testing is that there could be cold antibody titers and thermal amplitude in the Donald-Lanssteiner test. These may not be available in all routine laboratories. So, the current absence of UK external quality assurance scheme also limits the further testing for the final diagnosis. So, testing should therefore be conducted in laboratories performing these tests on a regular basis. The only limitation that they mentioned is that although diagnosis is not always straightforward, there would be, of course, the final diagnosis is made only after advice from a reference laboratory. So in patients with the autoimmune hemolytic anemia and a DAT positive for C3 and I press cold antibody using a direct agglutination test at room temperature. And patients with a positive cold and autoantibody screen should be further investigated with an antibody test titer. So basically, we first need to do the DAT and test positivity both for whether it's only for C3 or IgG. And if it is, then it should be screened for the cold antibody using the direct agglutination test at room temperature. This is done for 30 to 60 minutes. We had mentioned earlier as well that the patient's serum is tested against normal RBCs at room temperature for 30 to 60 minutes to detect the direct agglutination and to screen for the cold antibodies. Patients with positive cold autoantibody screen should be further investigated with an and those with this positive test should have been a titer done. This is to distinguish between the cold hemagglutinin disease and the cold agglutination syndrome. So in which case the titer would be so then 1 is to 64 in cold agglutination syndrome. That is the secondary cold agglutinin disease. So then antibody titer is then done in a laboratory performing these tests on a regular basis. And the EDTA sample, it needs to be warmed to 37 degrees centigrade in a water bath 1 hour prior to removal of plasma for testing. So before we remove the plasma for testing, we need to warm it in a water bath for 1 hour and then remove that plasma. So that the plasma then contains only those clinically significant cold antibodies that we will test on. In patients with suspected CHAD, the clotted sample for protein electrophoresis and immunofixation should be kept at. So those patients with the cold hemagglutination disease and those with the cold agglutination syndrome, basically all those which are samples which are tested for antibody titer and although they're tested at 4 degrees centigrade, the sample should be transported either at 37 degrees centigrade or warmed to 37 degrees centigrade in a water bath 1 hour prior to removal of plasma. And in those with primary cold hemagglutination disease, the clotted sample, we need to rule out whether the cold agglutinin disease is a primary disease or secondary to sort of underlying malignancy or lymphoma. So in these cases, the clotted sample should be tested for protein electrophoresis and immunofixation. And here again, the analytical, the pre-analytical control is that we should keep them at 37 degrees centigrade until the serum has been separated. So in either case, the sample needs to be kept at 37 degrees centigrade when either the serum is separated for serum protein electrophoresis or the plasma is tested for testing the antibody titers or thermal range. Then in all cases of suspected primary cold hemagglutinin disease, they should be reviewed by an appropriate hemato-oncology multidisciplinary team. Now, serological investigations of patients requiring a transfusion is also, as you had mentioned earlier, that this is very important in regarding management of these patients. So not only we do the DAT testing and we quantify whether hemolysis has been there and what type of hemolysis is, whether it's immune mediated, then whether it's if it's autoimmune, then whether it's warm, cold, or mixed type of hemolysis. But we also need to do further serological testing to for the diagnostic, for not only for the diagnostic part, but also for the therapeutic part, because these patients will they need blood transfusion, and we need to find the most compatible blood for them. So investigation should be guided by the guidelines on pre-transfusion compatibility procedures that are mentioned in section 6.5 and 7.13. And the main aims of the investigations are to determine the ABO, RH, and KEL status of the patient and identify alloantibodies in presence. So we need to not only do the blood grouping and RH testing, but even the KEL status needs to be, so the most common antibodies, they all need to be ruled out. Another thing that I think we missed in this algorithm was that when we go on for autoimmune antibodies, and it's a warm antibody or a cold antibody, but in the earlier phase, even if the DAT is negative, and we have a rule and we perform the Donner-Landsteiner test, then if the value comes out to be negative, then we would do the red cell evaluate, because the data can be negative as a procedure, as an analytical error even. So then the red cell evaluate needs to be done, or either we can reassess the alternatives. So here we can either do a red cell evaluate, or we can do this gel testing as you had mentioned earlier. So you can either do it on column agglutination technique, or gel testing, a solid phase, and even a red cell elevate can be done. If the red cell elevate is positive, then it's a DAT negative autoimmune hemolytic anemia. If the red cell elevate is negative, and all tests or all these Donner-Landsteiner is also negative, and all these tests by column agglutination are negative, then we may need to reassess alternatives. So, in these patients, once we have done all the DAT testing and antibody titers and specificity, and the antibody specificity needs to be found out. And in that case, most of the antibody specificity that we come across is that most of the warm autoantibodies, they primarily show sort of a the warm antibodies, that is, they can be IgG or IgG plus C3, and then most of them in Rh specificity, they are against the Rh antigen, or they may be they could be drug induced with the antibodies against the glycophorin A receptors on the surface of RBCs. In most of the cold agglutinins, they are usually IgM plus C3D, and because the that usually uses the IgG and C3D, so they could be even either C3D positive, so they could be and they are against the I antigen. So it could be either a big I or small I, or even the PR and the P antigen was present. And in this case, there is always intravascular hemolysis and agglutination of RBC is seen. In the case of warm autoimmune hemolytic anemias, there was extravascular hemolysis, and spherocytes are seen on peripheral smear. However, a mixed picture can be seen in cases of paroxysmal cold hemoglobinuria, whereas agglutination is also there, and spherocytes are also there, and then it's a specific feature of hemophagocytosis. It is erythrophagocytosis by the RBCs by neutrophils. Now, regarding the cold antibodies, mostly the antibody specificity can be either against the big anti-I, in which case mostly if it's polyclonal, then it would suggest infectious history. So it could be mycoplasma pneumoniae that is responsible for the anti-big I for specificity, and anti-small I specificity is polyclonal specificity is due to the infectious mononucleosis. However, in case of monoclonal specificity of anti-big I, it is mostly due to lymphoproliferative disorders, and anti-small I specificity is mostly with the CHAD associated disorders. So in CHAD, they could be anti-small I, anti-big I even, and anti-B, MN, or anywhere, and also even anti-PR specificity may be seen. So we need to be specific about not only the specificity, but also the clonality and the subtype of the antibody involved. Now the rescue emergency therapy, if we go into the treatment part of it, then there is this, first of all, the emergency treatment and then the non-emergency management. Regarding the emergency treatment, there are general strategies for all autoimmune hemolytic anemias. That is, investigations may reveal a treatable underlying cause such as infection. So if there is a treatable underlying cause, then we first we could generally treat the patient with antibiotics, and if drug induced, then the relevant medication should be stopped. So these are the general strategies. However, for emergency situations, we would need to transfuse the blood, and fully compatible blood would need to be transfused. This testing takes around about 4 to 6 hours or more if you need to do a full compatibility testing. And approximately 30% of patients will have autoimmune antibodies. They have underlying alloantibodies also. Most commonly, the RH or KEL, but these are rare if there is no history of previous transfusion of pregnancy. So mostly if there is history of transfusion and pregnancy, then there could be underlying alloantibodies also along with the autoantibodies. And if anemia is life-threatening, then transfusion with ABO, RH, and KEL matched blood is more appropriate than delaying until full serological investigations have been completed. In patients with a clinically significant cold type antibody, the use of a blood warmer and ensuring a warm environment for transfusion is rational enough, although the evidence of benefit is limited. So for most of the antibodies, if we just give them, transfuse them with the ABO, RH, and KEL matched blood, at even that will be appropriate, other than that, then delaying until full serological investigations have been completed. So in those with clinically significant cold type, even just the use of blood warmers to ensure a warm environment, or ensuring a warm environment for transfusion can be sufficient for them. So if anemia is life-threatening, in the time required full compatibility testing, transfuse with ABO, RH, and KEL matched RBCs, and consider the use of a blood warmer for transfusions in patients with cold autoimmune hemolytic anemia and or CHAD and mixed autoimmune hemolytic anemia and PCH. Now the warm autoimmune, so this was we were considering cold autoimmune hemolytic anemia in general strategies, and then the blood transfusion part. Now for the transfusion of anemia, options available from transfusion would be immunoglobulins, plasma exchange, and immunoglobulin therapy to like decrease the amount of antibodies, and plasma exchange to remove the amount of antibodies, and methyl prednisolone is to decrease the risk of serious is to decrease the antibodies intravascular hemolysis. Then for CHAD again, steroids would be used in both warm and cold. We would be using methyl prednisolone, intravenous methyl prednisolone. For cold antibodies, the overall response of CHAD to steroids is disappointing. However, oral the dose of prednisolone 1 milligram per kg per day may be considered as rescue therapy. So for autoimmune hemolytic anemias, we basically have like these 4 options. Of first of all, starting with steroids and immunoglobulins and plasma exchange, and then also splenectomy may be useful in some patients who become transfusion dependent and have no response to immunosuppression. But in case of cold, the options available are just usually steroids and plasma exchange. We do not use IVIG and other splenectomy is not given for cold immunoglobulins. So for cold, the options available in emergency are the steroids, but here also the response rates are low, and the responses are often partial and cannot be sustained without an unacceptably high steroid dose. So the steroid dose here also needs to be in the range of 1 milligram per kg per day, and they are used as a rescue therapy. Plasma exchange Also, responses are seen in 4 out of 6 case reports. However, responses are often transient, and like warm autoimmune hemolytic anemia, its role may be in stabilizing the patients with severe disease in conjunction with alternative therapy. Agglutination can occur within the cell separator also. So, a plasma exchange often the response is transient. That is, if it would only lead to a transient improvement in the agglutination. As soon as they are taken off this exchange, then they could again develop this agglutination. And also the agglutination can occur within the cell separator and its tubing, especially if the agglutinin is active at 37 degrees centigrade and room temperature. An extracorporeal circuit may need a high temperature setting. So daily or alternative day exchange with 1:1.5 times the plasma volume with albumin has been recommended. So this plasma exchange or steroid for life-threatening anemia is considered for primary CHAD, but for warm autoimmune hemolytic anemia, the general consideration is just that we would consider IVIG or plasma. So we would consider IVIG or plasma exchange, and then for severe or life-threatening. They mentioned that the methylprednisolone response, the experience of intravenous methylprednisolone is limited. And they have a role in pulmonary cases, but the risk of serious infection is also there with steroids. So steroids are not generally. The plasma exchange is basically one that is used for both warm autoantibodies and cold autoantibodies. And plasma exchange is done, but the benefits are only temporary. And in doing so, if the patient had a cold or autoimmune hemolytic anemias, then we need to take into account that if the agglutination could also occur within the cell separator and its tubing, and so the extracorporeal circuit needs to be set at higher temperature settings. Whereas whereas in case of warm or autoimmune hemolytic anemias, the plasma exchange has been used in patients with severe hemolysis while attempting control with other therapies such as immunosuppression. So it is used only as an interim therapy while immunosuppression is being tried with the use of methylprednisolone or IVIG. And IVIG with warm autoimmune hemolytic anemia, the response is uh, pretty much good. That is about 40% of patients that respond to IVIG, 0.4 to 0.5 gram per kg per day for 5 days. And the most responders, they maintain their hemoglobin for more than or equal to 3 weeks. So the response is not only, they not only respond, but the response is also maintained in most of the cases. And the response was predicted by low pre-treatment hemoglobin, and IVIG is accepted in the UK Department of Health as a short-term treatment when the hemoglobin is less than 60 gram per liter, but higher in patients with the comorbidities. So in patients even with comorbidities, even at higher hemoglobins, these IVIGs can be used. Otherwise, they are used in those cases that do not respond to transfusion or to have become transfusion dependent, and then we need to consider IVIG as an emergency treatment for these patients. So as an emergency measure, mostly for warm use IVIG, and then plasma exchange can be considered also, but the response is only temporary. And methylprednisolone has been used in pulmonary cases and emergency splenectomy. Most patients that do not that become severe transfusion dependent and have not responded to immune suppression may require urgent splenectomy. If the patient is not vaccinated 2 weeks prior to splenectomy, this should be deferred until 14 days post splenectomy. So either they should be vaccinated 2 weeks prior to splenectomy or 2 weeks after splenectomy. As a functional antibody responses are improved, then they should be vaccinated. In critically ill patients with warm autoimmune hemolytic anemia deemed unfit for splenectomy. So whenever we're talking about splenectomy, we need to talk about the vaccinations that come with it, because other from the because after splenectomy, the most important cause of morbidity or mortality in these patients is this post-splenectomy opportunistic infections. So, in critically ill patients with warm autoimmune hemolytic anemia deemed unfit for splenectomy. So, in those who, so the patients either the problem is the vaccination, or that they may be unfit for splenectomy due to And in those cases where there's lack of available blood to transfuse, we may even do partial splenic embolization. So now the non-emergency management strategies include venous thromboembolism prophylaxis. This is an important cause of morbidity and mortality in autoimmune hemolytic anemia, is more likely when hemolysis is active. So in cases of, for emergency purposes, we just use IVIG in case of warm, or mostly steroids and plasma exchange in case of cold. But for non-emergency management, we need to have the venous thromboembolism prophylaxis as a general strategy, and also folic acid, um, injection, and thromboprophylaxis are the main, and osteoporosis prevention. Then the specific management strategies, they include for primary autoimmune hemolytic anemia, they include, of course, the steroid therapy as a first line, and as second line, they mentioned rituximab in case of warm autoimmune hemolytic anemias. The third line is, of course, the the immune suppression, the immunosuppression by azathioprine, cyclosporine, danazol, and the mycophenolate mofetil and splenectomy. For patients failing the third line, there are case reports of using cyclophosphamide and hematopoietic stem cell transplant and other options. Now those managements for mixed autoimmune hemolytic anemia and CHAD are also dealt with in detail, and with cold hemolytic anemia. So I think we'll take a short break, and then probably we'll come down to the um, specific guidelines for all these managements. That is the first line, second line, and third line, and then the general management and the first, second, and third line managements of both warm and cold and mixed autoimmune hemolytic